All right. So we have Alan Brinkley, chapter 18, The Age of the City. This chapter is mostly a continuation of the previous chapter, chapter 19, where we are focused on this time period called the Gilded Age, which stretches roughly from 1865 to 1914. Let us call that the Gilded Age, or this term gilded means kind of like gold plated, that on the outside, there's a lot of things that might perhaps make the United States look like it's in a golden age. And we actually talked about some of those things last chapter, like the enormous growth of wealth, the expansion of the United States in terms of being a worldly economic and political power. But a lot of that prosperity is only on the surface, and that when you dig a little bit deeper in American society, there's kind of a much less golden side to it, so to speak. And so this chapter, especially chapter 18, this focuses more on what we might call the kind of social history. Social history, if you come across this term, think society. And that is more about the history of how everyday people live. Whereas in chapter 17, we talked a little bit about some of the social history there, especially as it pertains to the workers and how working conditions changed. But for the most part, in chapter 17, the previous chapter, most people are not Thomas Edison. Most people are not John Rockefeller. Most people did not participate in the Great Railroad Strike, or most people did not participate in the Pullman strike. We were focused a little bit more on the economics, a little bit more on the important events. Here in this chapter, we're going to get a better feel for how this era impacted kind of everyday people, right? Your typical person during the Gilded Age. So, one of the most important trends occurring in the post Civil War era is urban growth. Urban, if you're not familiar with that term, urban means like city, or the city areas, whereas rural means like the farm. And the Gilded Age is a time period where more and more people are moving into the cities. So much so that by about the year 1920, most Americans live in a city. We might say the US becomes an urban nation. So whereas before 1920, again, we're using 1914 as a stopping year here, just because that's when World War I broke out, but there's not really a specific year the Gilded Age ends. But this is a process by which the United States is being transformed from a rural city, or sorry, a rural country, a country of farmers, into an urban country, a country of city dwellers. And by 1920, or the 1920 census, that is complete. So, where did most of these city dwellers come from? Well, they came from two different areas. They came from immigration and in-migration, right? So, various migrations here. So, just to differentiate the two, we have in-migration and immigration. And in-migration refers to migrations within a country. So specifically, the in-migrations which were taking place in the United States was, from the most part, from the countryside to the urban areas. That there were a lot of people that were leaving the farms and moving into the cities. We might say leaving the farms, or leaving the farm for the city. And there were a lot of reasons to move to the city. One of those reasons could be the kind of what we call the pull factors. I think we may have mentioned this in the previous chapter, but in regards to immigration, there's always push versus pull. In other words, there are things that push people out of where they're living. So, for example, in the United States, this certainly could refer to kind of the hard times for farmers. Could be one of the push factors here. But also in terms of the pull factors, things like jobs and just the general allure of city life. One of the things we'll talk about in this chapter is the rise of leisure. The cities where a lot of kind of things were happening, so to speak, and that could bring a lot of people in. So that's in migration, and certainly a lot of in migration took place. But also, as we touched upon last chapter as well, there's also a lot of immigration, and immigration occurs between two countries. So this is when people move from one country to the other. And in the United States, again, just to reiterate what we mentioned already in chapter 17, the Gilded Age is the time period of the highest rate of immigration, specifically between the years 1870 and 1920. More people came to the United States in those years than any other time period, if we're talking about percentages, right? So a greater percentage of people. And especially this point about new, what was new about the immigrants after the Civil War? Well, what was new was where they had come from, that now people from Southern Europe or places like Italy were coming to the United States, places from Eastern Europe, um, places like Russia, for example, modern day Poland, Ukraine. Not a lot of people from Italy and not a lot of people from Eastern Europe had come to the United States before 1870. Immigrants from China on the West Coast, different religious groups like Jews who came to the United States. So that's what's new. And so both of these things, in migrations and immigrations, tended to contribute to the growth of cities, right, and city populations. When people came to US cities, they tended to live, work, and socialize along ethnic lines. You could find in places like New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, you can find ethnic cities, or sometimes a term that was used were ethnic ghettos. So we might say these are places in cities where ethnic communities, we might say, live and work. So for example, the quote unquote Chinatowns. So especially on the West Coast of the United States, places like San Francisco, Oakland, some of those other areas, many of the Chinese immigrants who arrived all congregated in one certain part of the city, which gave rise to ethnic cities. That is to say that ethnic ties were still very strong when groups moved over. And of course, you could apply this to various other groups, Little Italy, for example, or, different areas. Just to kind of point or touch back on this point of the rates of immigration, just to give us some statistics, in major American cities at the time, in places like Chicago, New York, right? These were some of the biggest cities in the United States. We'll also add Milwaukee, Wisconsin here. The percentage of people who were born outside of the United States, again, you're not going to find higher percentages than this time period. In places like Chicago, 87% of the people who resided in Chicago had either were immigrants themselves or were the children of immigrants. That is a vast majority of those people. And because of the ways that people, settled in a lot of these areas, various different ethnic enclaves. So one more other thing we might point out about the way that ethnicity served as a very important vehicle within these cities is that ethnic ties provided a system of support for immigrant groups. And a lot of times there could be various kind of symbols or institutions in these, various cities. So, for example, newspapers. I think in major American cities during the Gilded Age, you could probably find a newspaper in like at least 50 different languages. So, newspapers that were being published in mother tongue. A lot of times it was churches, a Polish church, an Italian church, whatever it might be, could serve as sort of a vehicle or an institution in which various communities could gather around. And also the establishment of what are called mutual aid societies. Because as you might imagine, for immigrants arriving in a foreign land, not really familiar with the history or the culture or the language, they're going to find themselves in a difficult situation. And so one way that immigrant groups could look after each other was to create these mutual aid societies in which all members of an ethnic community would contribute financially to pool their resources together. And then if one person in the community found hard times, maybe they lost their job, maybe they had a workplace accident. We talked about how dangerous the workplace was. Well, then that aid society could provide funds to look after one's group. So there's a tendency to think of the United States as sort of this great melting pot, right? This idea that anyone or everyone comes to the United States and they suddenly become American. That process is a lot more drawn out. In fact, ethnic ties, ethnic identity, cultural identity, linguistic identity, all of these things remained very strong and remained very, very important for a lot of the people that that moved to the United States in this particular period. So for those who arrived in the cities, especially those from immigrant backgrounds that have a different religion or culture or language, or maybe even a different racial background than the majority of Americans, there were pressures both to assimilate into American society, but also pressures that excluded them from American society. So, assimilation, if you're not familiar with this term, assimilation means to, in some sense, sort of blend in to the what we might call the majority culture. I mean, it doesn't, actually, technically, majority actually don't. I'm going to use a different word. Blend into the dominant culture. I'm going to use because sometimes it technically doesn't even have to be a it doesn't have to be the majority, so to speak. And assimilation can come in a lot of different ways. I mean, let's just think back. Think back to what was it, chapter 16, right? The way in which Native Americans were forced to assimilate, the pressures that they faced. In a lot of cases, that type of assimilation was at the end of a bayonet. Whereas the pressures to assimilate for immigrant groups are going to be different in some ways. There certainly is still the pressure to assimilate, but it's going to come in the form of things like schooling, for example. Public schools are becoming more popular, and one of the things that public schools do is they assimilate children into kind of using the dominant language and the dominant culture, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be a lot of pressure to assimilate from consumer culture. The lure of American fashion, American goods, American food, American music. And this sort of assimilation we might, just sort of take note is that for the first group of people who arrive, especially those who have no intention on permanently residing in the United States, they're just coming to the United States to make some money, and then they're going to go back home and stay permanently in the mother country, so to speak. This is less true. But for those that come and have children, it's typically not the first or even second generation that become more assimilated into American society. It's typically generational. All right, so we might just make a point here that assimilation means to blend into the dominant culture. Schools, consumer culture are sort of pressures, but assimilation, we might just say occurs generationally. That is, the grandkids of immigrants are much less likely to be picking up that newspaper that's in the mother tongue or practicing a religion that their grandparents practiced. Maybe even moving out of the ethnic enclave or ethnic community, moving out of the Chinatown into some other place. So it takes a little bit. It takes a little bit longer. But as with pretty much all other periods or points in immigration in the United States, there was also a lot of pressure, uh, on the part of various groups and people to exclude those who are arriving in the United States for various reasons. Some born out of just sort of xenophobia, racial bias, ethnic bias, some out of economic uncertainty. So, for example, workers' unions were typically anti-immigration because the effect that they had on wages, and others believing that immigrants with different cultures, different moral systems would have some sort of damaging or eroding effect on American society. And so there were some organizations that were created to limit the impact, limit immigration and limit the impact that immigrants had. The APA, or the American Protective Association, was established during the Gilded Age. This was primarily created to limit Catholic immigrants, and we'll also add and their influence. That is, this is an organization and their influence. So this is an organization that would politically campaign to try and have any sort of Catholic, nominees for certain political positions would go out and campaign to try and make sure that they don't win various office. So this was very much illustrative of the, religious divide between Protestants and Catholics. There is a kind of a tension between those two groups in the United States, even predating the Civil War. The majority of Americans, or at least the dominant culture at this time, was Protestant Christianity, but a growing number of Catholics from Ireland had arrived before the Civil War. A continuing or a growing number of Italians continued to arrive after the Civil War. And so, Protestants feared that, first of all, Catholics' moral systems, religious systems didn't line up quite, with Protestants. A lot of kind of apprehension and anxiety about the way that Christianity would be taught in public schools. That was a big battleground between Protestants and Catholics. And there was always this sort of prejudice on the part of Protestants that Catholics could never truly be like 100% patriotic. That at the end of the day, Catholics would be more loyal to the Pope than they would be loyal to their country. And so, for that reason, Protestants typically had a prejudice, against them. Other ways that exclusion was done was legislatively, instead of social organizations and the actions of people, but even all the way up to the national government. The Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. This would be the first law to first it was reduce but then it would be to prohibit immigration based on national origin. Again, immigration laws to the United States had always been pretty loose. There were and could be reasons to be denied entry into the United States. If you were maybe too poor, for example, mentally unfit, if you had a contagious disease, these could always be reasons why somebody might be denied entry. But it had never been based off of one's nationality, one's ethnicity, one's racial background. And in 1882, the United States passed the very first law that would make immigration based off of national origin. And it was the Chinese immigrants who were the first targeted. This wouldn't be the last law to do such a thing. Immigration laws later on in the 1920s would further restrict immigration based off of what country one came from. But at least for the time being, this is the beginning of those types of laws. So certainly, both pressures from immigrants to both assimilate into American society, but also pressures by others to exclude them. So, both of these factors, immigration and in migration, contributed to the growing urban landscape. Now, for a lot of these cities in early industrial society, the influx of people who were arriving created a whole host of problems. It's also true that many of these cities were completely unprepared to handle the massive influx of people. So, we might just say that cities grew too fast, too quickly. And as a result of that, that led to new problems, right? New problems. And it's kind of the way that people face these new problems and the way that they experience it, which kind of gives rise to the social aspect or the social history sort of side of this. Um, so, a lot of the overcrowding, the makeshift housing, um, a lot of these contributed to a living environment that was rather unpleasant. And especially those people who were in power sought to create spaces that were or could counterbalance or counteract some of the kind of overcrowding concrete jungle, um, really sort of unpleasant spaces. So, especially in the post Civil War period, there's an emphasis on creating public spaces that are more tolerable. There was a movement called the City Beautiful movement, and that was to make urban centers maybe more livable. And especially one sort of way that this was done was through things like parks, trees, and planned spaces. We might call this another maybe term for this is urban planning. Because a lot of the ways that cities grew, none of it was really planned out from the get go. Much of it was makeshift. People just came to cities and built or resided wherever they could. And so you could have a city where there are no really kind of like building codes or restrictions in terms of where residential houses could be, where businesses could be. You could have a slaughterhouse next to an orphanage, next to someone's home. And so, with a little bit more awareness of how cities grow, being able to put a park, trees, to plan a space. Okay, here's the residential areas, here's the business areas, et cetera, et cetera. This would ultimately lead to a sort of better living situation. One example that we can see from this image here is the creation of Central Park in New York, which was in 1850, they had started the construction of that, but certainly you get a contrast between kind of what the city would be like on this side, and then here, an actual area where there's some space, maybe some more fresh air, some trees, some gardens, some plants, et cetera, et cetera. So this would always be something that urban planners would have to try and contend with was creating a more livable, tolerable city. Because and a lot of times any sign of nature, grass, trees, that would all just be pushed out in favor of some sort of construction there. Probably the biggest problem, though, for those moving into the cities was the search for housing. Um, not only did workers face difficult conditions, like we talked about in chapter 17 with finding work, but maybe even more difficult was housing. There was a lot of homelessness, and we can sometimes, chalk up homelessness to, um, let's say, bad government policies or bad laws or something like that. But at the very sort of ground level, um, it's a numbers game, right? There are so many people and there are so many houses. And if there are just less houses than there are people, there's going to be homelessness. And especially for, during the time periods in these cities where the populations grew significantly, sometimes the influx of people just outnumbered or outpaced the rate at which homes could be built. So there were a lot of different ways to find solutions to this living situation. For those that were maybe a little bit more wealthy, the middle and upper class, the constructions of new homes could take place in surrounding areas, not just within the city itself, but surrounding the city. So these new suburbs, a suburb is, we'll just call these residential housing built on the edge of the cities. And we'll add for mostly for middle slash upper class. Because if one was a member of the working class, they typically couldn't afford some of this new housing or the new suburbs. The suburbs is not in the city, but it's sort of surrounding the city, and it allowed for middle and upper class people to work in the city, but then be able to commute home. We also have to recall that, in this era, we're still sort of pre-automobile. Henry Ford's Model T doesn't become really famous into the 1920s, and so we're dealing with cities and urban areas, and we can kind of see this a little bit in this image of Central Park here, in which the primary mode of getting around is by horseback or walking. And so not to mention all the problems that come with like sanitation, having a bunch of animals crowded into an area in which a bunch of people are crowded into. It's also not a very efficient way of getting around. And so, interestingly enough, a lot of cities kind of took innovative steps to try and solve the problem of transportation, within these various cities. And different cities, sort of handled it in different ways. Um, in some places, trains were constructed, right? Some cities were so densely congested, though, that there was no room to build a train. And so maybe something like an elevated train, so elevated trains, these were, trains that were built above the ground. Places in the Midwest, Chicago, those sorts of areas, built elevated trains. Various streetcars and trolleys. These were popular in places like San Francisco, with a street car and trolley. Places like New York and Boston built subways. That is to build transportation networks under the ground. So again, each sort of city kind of, use different methods of mass transit or mass transport. We might call this or think of it as like public transport, but the reality is that during the Gilded Age, this wasn't public; it was for private business, but it was mass transport. So maybe we'll just go ahead and take note of that. So we'll say different methods of mass transport. However, though, as soon as the automobile, right, Henry Ford's Model T, as soon as that becomes affordable, and by the end of the 1920s, by 1930, one in five American families own a car. A lot of these systems of transportation, not all of them, but a lot of them will become less popular. In fact, by the 1950s, 60s, even 70s, some of these ways of getting around would become completely obsolete, and automobiles would more or less replace everything. But at least for a short time period there, you could look in American cities and have a combination of horse-drawn carriages and subways, or horse-drawn carriages and trolley streetcars, or electric cars, sort of the ways to get people around these different areas. So that solved the problem of mass transit. And again, this was a private endeavor, so you had to have money to use these systems. And typically, there was a connection between the trains and streetcars in the new suburbs, so that those people who were the middle and upper class, they could take a streetcar down to their job, pay for it, and then take a train or streetcar back to their work. Now, what about for everyone else? Well, for everyone else, the cities remained very, very overcrowded. And while there were some efforts to try to alleviate the overcrowdedness, a lot of these problems continue to persist until kind of the next chapter in American history here, and that's the Progressive Era. So cities remained very, very much overcrowded, and this presented a lot of a lot of different problems, for Americans to sort of contend with. Um, so, one of the innovations that was heralded or proposed as a solution to the problem of overcrowded cities was tenement housing. So, tenement housing, we might say this was sort of a new housing development to house, we'll say, the maximum number of people, or the max number of people in the smallest space. And again, initially these were heralded as being a kind of very innovative solution to the problem of homelessness and trying to solve the city's housing problems. But the reality was is that a lot of the tenement housing had really, really sort of poor conditions. We might just say new housing development to house the max number of people in the smallest space. We might say contributed to harsh living conditions. So, for example, some of the tenement housing had no windows. So you might be in this very, very small confined space with no fresh air, no reliable way of getting garbage out. People might just throw garbage out the window. Or if there was something like an air shaft that provided ventilated air, people might just throw garbage in the air shaft. In much of the early tenement housings, no indoor plumbing. So, no way to flush human waste or get human waste out of the building. Um, no electricity in many of these earlier ones. So, again, what was heralded as sort of this innovation actually becomes a place in which people have to endure a lot of the problems that come with tenement housing. A lot of these problems that people faced in the city, though, were relatively unnoticed by the upper and middle class. And it took the effort of various reformers to try and make people aware of what the living condition was like for millions of people for millions of people in the United States at the time. Jacob Riis, he himself was a Danish immigrant, and he used a relatively new technology of the day, and that was a flash camera, or a camera that had a flash on it. And so he used photography to raise awareness about how the urban poor live. And, it was one thing to be able to write about it and tell people about it, but that didn't have the same type of impact as being able to see it for oneself. And the truth is that because of the pollution and other factors, some of these areas were just far too dark for a standard camera to work. And so it was only with the invention of flash photography that Jacob Riis could go down into some of the most poverty-stricken, darkest, dingiest, dangerous parts of American society, take photographs, and then publish that to the rest of the American public to try and get some reforms done to make the living situation better. His work, How the Other Half Lives, was kind of a piece of this type of journalism to try to inspire some reform. Here we have a photo of Jacob Riis. He's taken many, many famous photographs in American history. Some of them you might recognize. This one called Murderer's Row was one that was taken by Riis. Another one here, you can see the way in which this family is all kind of crowded in this very kind of congested and tight area. The problem of housing, the overcrowded aspect of housing, the unsanitary nature of it, the danger of it, having a lot of people crammed up into one area at once, just the general level of discomfort. This was something that Americans experienced, and for the most part, reforms were pretty slow coming. Um, for example, housing was so limited that in some areas, not only would you share a room, so you might rent a room in a tenement or rent a room in an apartment, but even within that room, you might only be able to rent a bed. So you could rent one single place to sleep, and that bed that you rented might not only be yours, you might have to share it with someone. So you can rent a bed for 8 hours, and for 8 hours you had a place to sleep, but after that 8 hours was up, then somebody else who had rented the bed, it would then be their turn. So a lot of difficulties that these families and others had to endure, and as we'll learn, generally speaking, a lot of the problems in the cities during the Gilded Age go relatively unattended, and it's not until the later progressive era that we begin to see reforms coming from a government level. Again, at this time, there are some avenues of alleviation, the ethnic communities and churches, like we talked about earlier. But for the most part, the government isn't too active in trying to solve various social problems. Now, one thing that helped contribute to the alleviation of this, well, in some ways it alleviated it, in some ways it made it worse, and that was the construction of skyscrapers. Like we talked about earlier, skyscrapers in a lot of ways are kind of like a symbol of the Gilded Age. Two sort of technologies, the steel made by the Bessemer process and electricity, which could allow for, um, not just elevators, but also electric lighting. Very dangerous to have that many people stacked on top of each other with open flame lighting. And, skyscrapers, a symbol of the Gilded Age, helped, oops, you might say helped cities expand. So it's interesting, cities during the Gilded Age, they kind of do two things. So, here you have your typical city during the Gilded Age. With the invention of things like trains and streetcars, the cities can expand outwards. And so there's a little bit of, I don't know if I would say it's misleading or it's kind of like a trick. But one of the ways or one of the reasons why, the cities had grown so much during the Gilded Age was because cities began expanding their own borders. So, for example, if we're just looking at this image, the orange here, let's just say that this is New York City, and it's New York City in 1860. Well, by 1880, because of streetcars and stuff like that, people can begin moving technically across the city lines. But New York City then incorporates it, right? So yes, the population of New York City is increasing dramatically during the Gilded Age, but it's also true that cities are expanding outwards. The cities themselves are becoming larger geographically. And then, of course, what the skyscrapers allow for then is that you can simply just build, these sort of structures up, and cities can like build on top of themselves. So, one of the ways in which cities could, um, expand, it was both outwards but also upwards. We'll just maybe add that here, outwards and upwards. And of course, it's the skyscrapers that allow for the cities to go mostly upwards, uh, in the up direction. And so yes, in some ways, maybe it helps alleviate overcrowding because now you can literally stack people on top of each other. But it also contributes it in some ways because now you have more people that are concentrated in one area. So maybe it makes the living conditions a little bit better, but it makes the transportation issue a little bit worse because now there's simply just more people there. So we've already got somewhat of a feel for kind of the strains of urban life, right? Certainly the overcrowding is one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the type of danger, right? Especially in terms of fires. The overcrowding of people in one sort of specific area could contribute to deadlier fires. And there are a number of fires in the United States that wipe out large portions of the city. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is perhaps one of the more well-known fires, and it burned certainly a considerable part of the city down, and kind of, in somewhat of an ironic way, really allowed for new construction. Some of the kind of newer technologies of the era included fireproof buildings. As a result of things like, the Great Chicago fire departments were created, or at least better fire departments. Um, a lot of the buildings that were built earlier, places like Chicago, New York, especially, they were built with mostly flammable materials. But once, a portion of the city burned down, at least in Chicago here, you could build kind of more up to date buildings. So fires were very dangerous, right? You can imagine the type of catastrophe that one could experience. Here's a group of people. Jacob Riis's photo. There's one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and with no sort of reliable lighting or reliable heat. It's going to be something like a wood burning stove or a coal burning stove, and just having that type of atmosphere, a flammable environment, very crowded, a lot of people, open flames. That's a recipe for disaster, and disasters occurred. Right, disasters occurred. Another major problem was disease, right? Disease was a big problem. In relation to disease, there was very little to know. So, very little to know, understanding about water contamination, right? Also, we might say little to no sewage system. And oftentimes, the sewage system and the water system were oftentimes the same thing. And that led to disease outbreaks that were very common, typically around supplies of water, human waste, animal waste. went into the same water source that people drank from and that people washed their clothes in. Indoor plumbing is, it's coming along, but it's not quite there for a lot of American cities. And so it was very dangerous. In fact, in some of these early urban centers, the life expectancy could actually be shorter than out in the countryside or the rural area, kind of due to those factors. In terms of environmental degradation, again, we want to kind of point to water sources. In fact, some of the first kind of improvements that governments begin to make in these cities is to try and, um, try and get a hold of water contamination, right? To separate the sewage from the water supply, and that's one of the first places that cities tend to act. But another aspect of environmental degradation has to do with the air, pollution, pollution due to coal burning factories. Again, no real building codes. So if you lived right next to a factory that was burning coal 24/7, you were constantly breathing that in. This caused respiratory problems. You might just also add just the general. Oh, I guess we already got pollution there, so we can leave it at that. Um, there was a what they would call sort of a general quote unquote whatever, cities like London and others. There's a sort of fog about them, right? Like a dark cloud of not just all the coal burning factories, which were, constantly producing things, but again, people who kept warm, especially in areas that would get cold, wood burning, coal burning, really whatever you could burn, burning trash, contributed to a very, very poor air quality, and that had an effect on people's health. The type of overcrowding and unpreparedness also contributed to the growth of poverty, the growth of crime, and the growth of violence. Now, some reformers of the era believed that the problems of poverty, crime, and violence were due to some sort of moral failing. Whereas generally today, we would say that, things like overcrowding, inadequate education, that there are systems in place that more or less can contribute to one's failure or success, or can contribute to high or low crime. And so the United States is kind of at a crossroads here. I would say that the majority of Americans in the Gilded Age still believe that things like criminal behavior, immorality, violence, that these are mostly still personal failings. But there are others like Jacob Riis who are beginning to make more Americans known that crime rates are more of, they're more, what's responsible for crime rates is less what an individual's moral compass is, and more of the infrastructure and systems that are around them. So urban poverty, crime, violence, this was something that middle and upper classes sort of slowly, um, middle and upper classes slowly saw this as a problem to solve, right? But again, very slowly. And it wouldn't be into the progressive era that you begin to have more of a widespread um, kind of effort to solve these problems. So, for those that believe that poverty, crime, and violence was more of a moral failing, they identified these people as the deserving poor. So, the deserving poor were those who were maybe poor, but not because of their own action, or you might say moral failings, right? So, these are the people that, um, you know, could do everything in their power to avoid the trap of poverty, but it's not because it was anything they did, but it was because of the circumstance that they found themselves in. Um, and so this was sort of the group of people that many reformers targeted as wanting to help, right? The people who did not, have any moral failings. What do we mean by moral failings? Well, this could be anything from, alcohol, alcohol to gambling to prostitution, you name whatever sort of, moral failing that you want, and that's kind of under that category. Um, Another contributing factor, another aspect that was true in these cities was rising crime rates. We might just say that during the Gilded Age, there were high crime rates. And, this was a result of, overcrowdedness. This was a result of poverty, really a lack of resources by policing. Police had never had to police so many people in one sort of small area at once. So, this was also one of the things that people living in cities had to contend with at the time. And, middle and upper classes would look to try and solve some of these problems, at least slowly, right? Emphasis is on slowly because we want to remember or think of the Gilded Age mostly as a time period of government inaction. So again, just to kind of give us a chronology of the events here, the Gilded Age is from 1865 to 1914. It's where a lot of the problems arise, and then we have this point in American history called the Progressive Era, which follows the Gilded Age. And again, there's no sort of hard start date on the Progressive Era. Um, we could say that it's, to make things simple, we can just say 1900 till about 1920. And it's in this era that finally some solutions come from the government, right? Some solutions come from the government. But for the time being, how does one deal with, the pollution, the rising crime rates, the poverty? It's relying on, a community, immigrant or otherwise, at least for the time being. Now, with that being said, there is kind of one other major way in which some people are receiving support, right? Sort of one avenue of assistance for the millions of people who are experiencing this time period. And that is something we call the political machine, right? The political machine and the boss. The boss is simply just the head of the political machine. But a political machine is sort of like a combination of an organized, we'll say organized crime ring, and a political party, right? So maybe it's like if you took the mafia and a political party and mixed them together, that's what a political machine is. And the boss is just the leader, right? So they use these terms: political boss, political machine, et cetera, et cetera. And one ways in which political machines offered people support was they would want to go out and get their votes, because one thing that immigrants had, male immigrants in particular, especially before 1920, in on the majority of the country, anyways, male immigrants had the power to vote. And so, what political machines would do is they would go out and try and get the votes from the people who lived in some of the the most poverty stricken areas of the country. So this would be maybe we might say, illustrate this point, machines provided the urban poor with, we'll say, support, help, resources, um, in exchange for votes. So the idea is that this machine, let's say they want to run for office, they want to be the mayor of some city. Well, they would go to, again, the most poverty stricken area, maybe provide something like trash cleanup for the streets, maybe provide some immediate support in terms of money or food or something like that. But they would give the community something. And whatever that something was, it was expected that the members of that community, immigrants or otherwise, would then vote for that political party. Now, that's kind of gets that sort of gets us to this aspect of the political party part of it, right? This is just a regular political party in this sense. But once the political machine would get in power, they would use their position to then enrich themselves. So that's what the exchange was, right? Giving some sort of assistance or help to urban communities that are struck by poverty. Again, where government is typically not providing any assistance. Exchange, they would vote for members of the machine or they would vote for the boss. And once the boss got into power, then they would use their position to enrich themselves. The most famous boss was William M. Tweed. We might say the most famous boss. And he was in charge of the Tammany Hall political machine of New York. Again, probably the most famous machine. And, just to give you an idea of kind of the ways in which machines would work once they got into power, probably the most infamous thing about Tammany Halls was the Tammany Courthouse. So the Tammany Hall ring would go out to, poverty-stricken areas of New York, offer them something, get elected, but then once elected into office, would then use corruption to enrich themselves. The Tammany Courthouse, this was a courthouse that was under construction. Um, and the construction of the courthouse was perpetual. And, Tammany, or Boss Tweed, who was in charge of it, would use city resources to build this courthouse, but the resources wouldn't actually go to the construction, they would just go into his pocket. And so the idea was that this courthouse would never actually be constructed. They never intended to finish building it. They wanted to kind of keep it perpetually being built. That way, they can continue to funnel money and enrich themselves. And that's just kind of one way in which the political machines work. So we certainly get the aspect of political corruption in the Gilded Age at this time, but we also have one of the very, very few avenues for which urban communities were given any sort of relief by those who had any sort of wealth or or political power. Now, on the other side of this, we had talked about the Gilded Age as being kind of this golden outside, but maybe this less golden inside, so to speak. But one aspect of the kind of golden side to it is the rise of mass consumption, right? Remember that, technology, that for all the ways in which the workplace changed and workers were worse off, we talked about how the workplace changed and how workers found themselves in a more difficult situation, literally fighting for better pay, fighting for safer conditions. Technology led to more and cheaper goods, right? There was a rise of mass consumption, people purchasing goods. And that is to say, things like clothing, rather than just buying the materials and making it yourself, which is what maybe people would do. they can now afford to purchase the clothes already made because the factories were so sophisticated that it was just cheaper for them to make the clothing themselves. Things like soap or newspapers. A lot of things were cheaper and a lot of things were more available, and so this led to overall, we might say, if we look at the grand scheme of things, the Gilded Age led to a higher material standard of living, right? That certainly, some had it bad, for sure, and certainly by today's standards. But generally speaking, if we look at the broad pattern during the Gilded Age, the material standard of living, that is, the material wealth that people had in terms of consumer items, increased dramatically, right? The old kind of saying, a rising tide floats all boats. Everybody was maybe a little bit, well, the majority of Americans were a little bit better off, whereas some, your Rockefellers and your Carnegie types, of course, they were, light years ahead in terms of wealth. And so Americans became much more concerned with consumerism, sort of an entire culture of purchasing things. And you can see this reflected in American or American culture in a number of ways. The rise in advertisements. As we see illustrated here, advertisements are typically seen as something that's kind of annoying, but for society to have an advertisement or have a lot of advertisements is actually quite a good thing. It means that the supply of goods outweighs the demand. There are more things to be purchased than there are things to be bought. Also, a rise in retail stores, or we might say department stores. Stores were built to be kind of like an experience. Shopping was more of a thing to do than a necessity. And, companies got really good in terms of advertising their products and building these various department stores to be somewhat of an experience, to sell beds in the same places that you sell sewing machines and maybe provide something like a daycare or provide like a lunch counter. It was, sort of a spectacle or an experience to be had. And we might also add to this for those people moving out on the West, mail order catalogs. One thing that railroads can bring to people out west was consumer goods, and people could purchase things, and they would be brought out to the West via trains. The famous Sears catalog. The Sears catalog and the Sears department store was really kind of a mainstay of American consumer culture, and a lot of those department stores, which interestingly now we're kind of entering into a kind of a post department store era where online companies are kind of taking over the marketplace. But those things were synonymous with American culture for a very, very long time, and they had their origins in the in the Gilded Age here. We're not going to talk too much about the culture of the Gilded Age. I know there are a couple sections in the textbook that touch upon kind of education, culture of middle class, culture of upper classes. We're not really going to talk about those too much. Just kind of 2 points here. The one point that we talked about on consumer culture here, but also the rise of leisure. So outside of leisure and consumer culture, we're not going to talk too much more about some of the other trends in Gilded Age culture. But leisure was also another kind of aspect that grew. So in addition to the technology, even though people who worked in the factories worked very, very long hours, actually led to less time working And the jobs that a factory could provide provided you wages on average. Again, on average, the average workday went down. And we can also think about this not just in the work, but also at home. Various appliances, labor saving appliances being made gave more people to do leisure, which is like time for fun. And, it's kind of interesting because, before the Gilded Age, leisure was not really thought of, in kind of a meaningful way. I mean, leisure was almost like a bad thing. It was compared with like laziness. And that was because life was so tough for, in that era that pretty much every single moment of your waking time that you could dedicate to farm work or whatever it was, that was necessary. But now people could go to work, earn their wage, kind of have enough to get by, and maybe have enough time and money to engage in something like leisure for fun. And so the leisure industry was born. I mean, part because of the less labor required, but also part because of some new technologies. Spectator sports were big during the Gilded Age. The rise of things like boxing, baseball. The very first World Series was played in the Gilded Age. In the United States, football, the NCAA was created as a way. Football was a collegiate sport or played at the college level. Um, you also had various other forms of entertainment, music, which thanks to inventions like the phonograph, was now could be replicated. Vaudeville is a sort of like traveling, kind of like the best way I can describe it is like an adult talent show. But just sort of like a traveling show, and vaudeville performances would take place or happen at various cities. This allowed for the rise of like kind of like the first celebrities in some ways. A great example of this is Harry Houdini, which through various magic tricks, attracted huge crowds of people that would go out and see him. Um, but it could be magic shows, dancing shows, singing shows, like juggling acts, strongman performances. Theater was popular. Theater had existed prior to the Gilded Age, too. Shakespeare plays, stuff like that. It was mostly an urban kind of thing. Again, just to kind of tie something into a previous chapter. Remember we talked about Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, right? We might be able to um, kind of, I guess we'd put the quotes around the buffalo, not the bill. We can kind of tie that to some of these traveling shows, and then of course movies and films, and especially after Thomas Edison's inventions, movies would come to dominate the American entertainment. Again, just to kind of give us or demonstrate to us uh, a changing sign of the times. That is to say, by 1930, the number of movie theaters outgrew the number of churches for the first time. And again, that's kind of very indicative of the direction or trend that American culture is heading.